Hi, everyone. My name is Gretchen Vogel. Thank you for coming to play with the ideas that I have channeled in meditation for many decades. We're continuing with grief today. Um, this is part 3 of grief and how emotions are generated first in the physical body before they're felt in the mind. Um, that was the topic of the first video. Uh, we always think that emotions just happen, but they happen in our body first. So we do have choices about how we deal with our emotion. And emotional self management is something that we learn as we age. Um, And so we're going to continue with emotional self-management. And I hope the sound is right. I'm a little bit farther away from my microphone. Maybe I can move it a little closer, because I like to give you guys something different to look at in the background. You might get sick of looking at me. Anyway, uh, so basically, emotions are a dance between the body and the conscious mind. Um, as they say, the energy pulses back and forth. The chemicals that are produced in the endocrine system are the origin of emotional energy. And so that sets the stage for how we can observe and manage our emotions. Um, and we will be specifically talking about grief. Now, I do have an ear set in because I want to make sure that I don't miss anything, because this meditations is very cool. So we're going to start and we'll see how it goes. So if a thought, say something that reminds me of my brother, triggers an emotion, that triggers a chemical reaction or a response. And then that chemical response affects your mind. So you can get into a vicious cycle between mind and body where the same emotion just circulates around and around. The thought produces the feeling produces the thought or emotion. So emotional management is a bit of a disconnect between these two. Management is when you have the perspective, the ability to look at your emotions from a distance, being objective about your own emotions. So as you develop objectivity about your emotion or observation about your emotions, it doesn't mean that you feel them less. This observation actually makes you feel more aware of your emotions. If you're really aware of what you're feeling, then you're going to feel them more appropriately. Make choices about feeling them, not more intensely, but feeling them completely. So the real difficulty with grief is when grief takes over, when the emotion of grief takes over every other function. And sometimes in the case of extremely tragic losses, this has to happen for a while. But normally within a year, the preoccupation of with grief to the exclusion of everything else does fade. And then your life starts to be modified and changed. Of course, we're changed by these losses. I was thinking of a person that I know who lost many members of his family at the same time. And when we're thinking about um, that kind of temporal loss, it's going to take that person longer to lift up their head and look at the world. I mean, to me, grief is like a different land when you're really immersed with grief. You're living in a different place than anybody else. And for most people, this is a year, but in the case of multiple losses, it may take 4 or 5 years to rejoin the living. But what we're talking about is when the emotion seems addictive, that they cannot move on and join the outside world again. The grief itself has become somewhat addictive. So they feel that if they're not feeling it, they are not honoring their loved one or some other belief. Grief can become a completely encompassing reality. So people can get stuck in the emotion of grief, particularly if there's a series of losses. At that point, people might seek medical help if they're severely depressed. That might be the right thing to do. To change the chemical composition of the body in order to, well, not suicide, which is a major risk with sequential losses, particularly if a very close loved one self transitions. Um, if you feel too much grief over too long a period of time, these emotions can produce the desire to suicide because you can't stand to live in your own body and you don't feel that there's any other way to live or any other reality that would give you some relief from your grief. Let's see where this is going next. And this is why managing grief is also important. So when we say to manage the emotion, it doesn't mean to not feel the emotion. You need to feel grief appropriately and not self destructively and not destructively to another person. When people are deeply under the influence of emotion, other people need to understand that they're not themselves. You've so anything that is done around people who are deeply in grief has to be done with awareness and carefully by the people that are around them. Now, grief is a necessary part of life, but the management of grief is a useful tool to develop for all of us. Grief can't usually be managed until it's embraced and entered and felt. And then at some later time, months or years later, then it can be managed. The resolution is not to not feel it. Management means being able to make a choice around this loop between your um, physically uh, physically generated so that you can function in your walking and waking life. Grief is not something that comes and goes. That's a bit of a misunderstanding. Certainly, somebody who is in profound grief over a major loss is always experiencing on some level. But experience makes it, uh, gives us the ability to make choices about how and where we grieve. Now, I had a cousin who had a really lovely upbringing, a lovely life, and then she lost her young son in an auto accident. And she had no losses before. And then to move into such an enormous loss um, took her took her a lot of energy to process over the years. So people who have not experienced grief and then experience sudden, I mean, I just think about these parents with Sandy Hook. Um, but as we age, we have experienced so much loss. It doesn't mean we're not sad. It doesn't mean that we don't experience grief. It just means that we're able to function and have the emotion that is at an appropriate level and intermittent, so you can still carry on your life. You can have other thoughts, and grief does not always take up all of your attention. This is what one learns in the grieving process, is to manage grief. Um, Now, when they talked about the disconnect of directing a thought, the meditation part is over. Now I'm kind of on my own. Um, but I wanted to go back to that sort of disconnect of that loop between, um, uh, it really is like a circular obsessive thought, um, particularly long after, if you're still not able to enter the world because of grief. Um, I mean, there are some things that I've done that I'll share with you. Obviously, gratitude is the most powerful tool we have emotionally. Uh, I had a loss of a horse, my horse of a lifetime. At the age of 5, we were just beginning to do dressage. I mean, this was a while ago, and this was the horse who was teaching me so much. And I bred him. And when he was in his mother and I'd talk to him, his little hooves would drum on the side of her body. When he was born, he came to me. He actually didn't, his mother did not produce milk, so I hand raised Ollie. And when he had to be euthanized at the age of 6 from hyperinsulinemia, uh, it was a loss that brought me to my knees. I was saying before God, if you take this horse, I will never talk to you again. I, I knew that this was going to be profound, like losing a child, and it was. Um, of course, I have a little bit of an advantage because I could see him next to me in my mind's eye. I knew he wasn't completely gone. I just knew that my physical interaction with him was over. And yes, that is a comfort, but that isn't a big enough comfort uh, for most people, and it wasn't a big enough comfort for me. I do not know whether Ollie will still be self-knowing when I um, arrive in the world of spirit. I don't know that for sure. Um, but eventually, the pain decreased and I recovered, uh, as one person says, reset spiritually. And the way I did it was through gratitude, of being grateful to have even had that experience. Um, I think the other thing that helps us disconnect our thoughts of grief is to have profound trust in um, the mystery that we don't know. We just don't know um, whether some of our profound losses, and of course we always take it personally, of course we do, uh, might have been uh, our beloved's time to go. It might have been their sole choice. We just don't know. There's so much we won't know until we know. So we can make choices about how we think about our loss. And again, this is not to delude ourselves, it is just to disconnect if we get addicted to um, feeling depressed, feeling bad. We can take self responsibility and scrape ourselves up off the pavement eventually and rejoin life. So, thank you very much for coming to play with my ideas today. And my website is howspiritworks.com. And I do have a book on called Choices in the Afterlife. It is available through Amazon and through my website. And I really should redo it. It was done a while ago. I'm thinking differently about things now. But thank you. Thank you for coming, and I'll see you again soon.